Tasers are used by police forces in other Canadian provinces and, in fact, around the world as an intervention alternative to guns. And now, Ontario's frontline police officers may join that group as Queen's Park moves to allow expanded Taser use in this province. Joining us now to debate whether that's a good idea, Abby Deschman. She is director of the Public Safety Program with the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and Michael Federico. He is Deputy Chief with the Toronto Police Service and the lead for the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police on the use of force issues. Good to have you both here in our studio today. All right, well, you know the news. Last week, the province opened the door to allow, what are they technically called? Conducted energy weapons?
That's correct.
Okay, tasers, what everybody else calls them, for frontline officers to use them. What's your view on this?
Well, we welcome the news. It does add one more option that a police officer can bring to bear in a situation where the officer has made a decision to use force. A couple of important things to note, though. I think the discussion has to be around the officer's decision to use force rather than the choice of the weapon that the officer will actually employ. The real issue that I think the community wants us to grapple with is, was the decision to use force justified in the first circumstance? And then a decision about a particular option that we've equipped our officer is depending upon the nature of the threat that the officer is facing. One other thing, Steve, if you don't mind, I'd like to point out that we do not advocate the CEW as an alternative to lethal force. It's an additional option.
It's another tool.
So, in other words, if we're threatened by somebody who has a lethal force option available to them, it's really a lethal force response that's required. So the CEW wouldn't be used in a situation where a police officer is being shot at, for example. And when the word alternative gets used, I always just like to make a little point of clarification.
Appreciate the clarification. Abby Deschman, your view on this change?
Well, actually, very similarly, our concern is the decision to use force. And one of the things that comes up with that is, why is the province now focusing on tasers as opposed to other recommendations that inquests have made, that public interest groups have made about de-escalation, about alternatives to using force. So we would have really liked to see, if they're going to go down the road of expanded taser usage, we do think it can be an appropriate law enforcement tool if it's used under the right circumstances. We would have also liked to see a second component of that is, how you limit the use of force altogether. There are multiple investigations going on right now. There is a ministry review about interactions with individuals with mental health needs. Those are still ongoing, yet they've moved forward with this piece of it. We would have liked to see the whole package move forward altogether.
Why do you think they've just singled out this piece of the package as opposed to the bigger picture?
Well, it's a good question. I know police forces associations have been particularly active in asking for tasers to be expanded. The same energy perhaps isn't behind some of the more health-focused initiatives. There are cost concerns that have been raised with expanding some of the crisis intervention teams. Obviously, there's costs associated with tasers as well, but it hasn't received the same amount of attention.
Can you tell us why you think police prefer to have this tool as part of their toolkit in responding to violent circumstances?
Well, from the policing perspective, we're quite satisfied that the research demonstrates it's actually less harm-inducing. It results in fewer injuries to people that we need to take under control than the other use of force options, including what we call empty hand techniques: grabbing, wrestling, punching, twisting. So,
when you say fewer injuries, you mean to officers and the other person as well?
And to the person who's being placed under arrest, who's the force against, we're applying the force option against. So we found, research has demonstrated, and the ministry was persuaded by this, that the use of the CEW under appropriate circumstances is also less likely to result in physical harm to the person we're applying it to, or to the police officer. I'd like to pick up a theme, though, if you don't mind, that Abby made about the investment in responding to the general health and welfare of the community, and I think that's important. And I'd like to acknowledge that police leaders have been very progressive in this respect, that while we welcome the news for any additional tool that a police officer can bring to bear, that ought not to be introduced without investment in other areas of health care, particularly around our response to those who suffer from mental disorders. We need a total community response, and that includes housing, that includes community supports at the grassroots levels, family support, as well as police response.
I think you probably sign on to that too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, but when we're looking at those kinds of investments, the police is not going to be spending more on mental health issues and health care and that kind of thing. That's something for the province to do. But the province is also telling you here they're not going to give you more money for these tasers. If you Toronto Police want to find it in your budget to do that, that's fine. So do you have the money for this?
Well, that's an appropriate actual position for the ministry to take because, quite frankly, the ministry is not responsible for equipping every individual police service. It couldn't be. So the question about the priority that CEWs place in the general allocation of funds is a question for the local authority, the chief and the board, to discuss. We're quite confident in Toronto Police that we can actually introduce an increasing number of devices to give our police officers the options they need within the budget that we've got.
Okay, but you're not going to get more money for this.
Right.
So if you want this, something else is going to have to be taken out of the budget.
It's always a matter of balancing. So,
right.
But what the chief will undertake, and what I'll commit to, is it won't come at the expense of other worthy, important police programs. It will be an adjunct to, but we'll modify and adjust as required.
I want to see if you believe that.
Well, it's hard to know. We know that police forces are facing significant budgetary restraints. Police service boards across the province are very concerned about ballooning police budgets. It's hard to imagine where extra money for extra equipment is going to be found in a time of fiscal constraint.
Well, presumably it comes at the expense of something else. So if they want more money for tasers, what are they not going to be spending the money on?
It's a matter of degree, though. It's not, no police chief that I have spoken to, I'm aware, is going to suspend or interrupt some necessary police program in order to acquire more CEWs. There'll always be a blending and a balancing of police priorities. But it's appropriate that it become a local decision between the chief and the board.
Can I just understand as well, there are some, you know more about this than I do, but from what I've seen, there are some tasers where you have to be in contact with the person, and there are others where you can be 20 feet away and just aim it and it works. Which type does the officer that you know want?
The police tool, the police weapon, has both options available. And in normal circumstances, it depends on the nature of the threat. If the person is moved in close on the police officer is unlikely to be able to actually fire the probes, so might apply the weapon directly to the individual. That's called that drive stun mode. You may have heard that term. But if there's enough distance, and again, the officer makes a decision that force is appropriate under these circumstances, the officer can fire the probes. That immobilizes the individual, gives the officer and the officer's escorts enough time to move in and put the handcuffs on somebody.
You've heard this expression, a trigger-happy cop, before. When we talk about guns, I wonder whether you have any concerns about taser trigger-happy cops if this becomes part of the arsenal.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a considerable difficulty in an officer firing a gun. That is a very, very, very serious action. I don't think the same psychological barrier is there in firing a taser. Chances are this person is not going to suffer long-term health consequences or die as a result. It is excruciatingly painful. I have not been tasered. Perhaps you have. I know police officers are often tasered in training.
Have you been tasered before? No.
No, there we go.
Because I've heard that too. Sometimes in training.
Well, actually, there's a technical debate about whether or not it's pain-induced or the immobilization sensation is so extreme that it's associated with pain. I'll leave the scientists to work that out. But actually, I share the same concern that we need to make sure our police officers are properly trained, properly guided, have the confidence to use the device properly with the right amount of judgment. And we invest a lot. I'd have to say on a preponderance of evidence, I'm quite satisfied and quite confident that our officers will remain responsible in the use of this device. Toronto Police have had an enviable record of the deployment of CEWs.
Go ahead.
I have to add, we do have outstanding concerns about the deployment threshold. So the Braidwood Commission, which is the commission that looked into the death of Robert Jacansky, recommended a standard at which tasers should be deployed by police officers. That was when there's an imminent threat of bodily harm or death, then a police officer should be able to fire a taser to address that imminent threat. The standard in Ontario is lower than that. It is assaultive behavior, threatened assaultive behavior, or a need to control the subject. That's a very wide range of behaviors that can lead to an officer under the current use of force wheel deploying that tool. So we have additional concerns about what circumstances circumstances this weapon will be used under.
Does that need to be tightened up in your view?
Yeah, absolutely.
Would you be open to tightening up those
We're always
guidelines?
willing to look at our practices and procedures and policies that support those practices. I would point out that I would argue that we're not so far away from Braidwood, if we're far away at all, because Braidwood heavily qualified his observations that there had to be an imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death. In fact, he made allowances for circumstances where police officers apprehend a threat and are allowed to take action. It would be absurd for a police officer to have to actually be struck, or a police officer to have to witness somebody actually being struck or wounded before being able to intervene, and Braidwood doesn't make that point. On the other hand, in Ontario, we have a long history of using the device quite responsibly, and the threshold was a consequence of very, very careful collaboration and consideration by a lot of stakeholders. And so the ministry and the police are satisfied that the assaultive level will be appropriate for the circumstances that in Ontario police officers are going to face.
Tell me, though, if you think this is a common sense conclusion to come to. On the rare occasions when your officers have to draw their guns, that's a big deal. It's serious, right? There's who knows where the consequences go if they potentially have to use the weapon. There are forms to be filled out afterwards, maybe SIU's called in. Anyway, it's a big deal. This gives you a much sort of lower threshold option or alternative besides pulling the gun. Does it stand to reason then that cops are going to use tasers a lot more than they're going to use guns?
Oh, well, in all likelihood they will, because cops are faced with events that don't reach the lethal or serious bodily harm threshold anyway. But that still doesn't justify, just simply because an officer is facing a potential threat, doesn't justify the use of any force. The officer has to make a decision both subjectively and objectively based upon the circumstances. So all the CEW has done is introduce one more option. But also, every progressive police leader that I know is conscious that the device has generated a lot of public interest and has captured the public imagination. And so that's why it actually has a distinction in the use of force model from the other two intermediate weapons as far as threshold. So in Ontario, the threshold for the CEW is assaultive. That distinguishes it from the other intermediate force options that are available to police. And we've got practices, procedures, training, and supervision to make sure that we comply with that.
And having said all of that, bad things still happen. So I'm wondering, when an officer pulls his or her gun, reports have to be filled out. Should that be the case for tasers as well, in your view, Abby?
It should, and it is.
It will be.
In fairness to, there are significant oversight capabilities. Every time a taser is fired, it's logged. There's a time log, there's a frequency log, there's a duration log. Those are reviewed. We have asked for a comprehensive review of this expansion after a few years. If individual police forces do actually go down that road of equipping more frontline officers with tasers, we've asked for additional reviews, but it will be subject to use of force reports.
Madeleine Mayer is the Minister of Community Safety and Correctional Services at Queen's Park. She had a news conference about this last week, and here's some of what she had to say. She said, "This decision was made after carefully considering both peer-reviewed medical research and coroner's inquest findings. Our police officers are trained to use de-escalation first whenever possible, but when that approach doesn't work, we need to equip our officers with another tool. Expanded conducted energy weapon deployment will help protect Ontarians and keep our communities safe." Okay, there she is on the record. She also said that the introduction of this change in policy has nothing to do with a guy named Sami Yatim. And again, common sense tells you, that may be true, but common sense tells you that's a hard sell. What do you think?
Well, I can only speak to my experiences. We have been consulted about this decision for months and months. So I do know that this was actively on the government's agenda prior to the Yatim shooting. Now, the precise timing of the announcement, whether they delayed it, it was on the 1-month anniversary of the shooting. Did that have some resonance? I'm not sure, but I do know that in the fall, the government was talking to us about upcoming labor board decisions, workplace health and safety filed by police officers, actually, that were requesting expanded taser usage and that they were considering moving forward with it.
So, coincidence?
I think it is. I personally have been involved in the working group researching the introduction and then the use of the CEW, including expanded use, and I've been at it for years. So this isn't something that the ministry just thought of, even as early as this, or as late as this year. This has been on the ministry's agenda for quite some time. So I can't speak for the ministry in terms of the specific timing of the announcement, but I can say that the ministry has been working on this file with us for many, many years.
And I'll also add that I do think context is important, and I actually think they should have taken more from the Sammy Yatim shooting. We knew this announcement was likely coming down the pipes this summer. I would have liked to see it incorporate some of the ongoing public concerns about de-escalation, the ongoing reviews that are happening. We have an ombudsman review into de-escalation techniques. We have ongoing reviews into interactions with the mental health community. I would have actually liked to see those sync up more in terms of how the government was dealing with this particular issue.
But are you content that tasers belong in a conversation that we appear to be having right now about de-escalation?
It's a tool. And I think the studies do show that when they are used appropriately, they can lead to safer outcomes for some people. The question is, what is the appropriate time to use them, and what safeguards do you put in place to ensure that really that line is held to, and it's a very high standard. I think there are real risks that this is a slippery slope, that it could lead to increased usage in places that we really don't think it's appropriate. So what are the safeguards we need to put in place, and what are the complementary training techniques that we need to have to make sure that use of force is not used when it's not necessary?
Abby Deschman from the CCLA, you get the last word, because Deputy Chief Mike Federico, you got the first word. Thanks to both of you for coming in tonight and helping us out with this.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.